What do we think of when we think about freedom? For the most part, it's having enough of something that it no longer concerns us. It's having enough money or time, resources, customers. It always looks like something. When we can picture it and give it some kind of form or shape, it's easier to connect with the sense of relief or expansiveness that the idea of having those things would actually bring. The trouble with that is that, for the most part, it only stays as an idea. It stays as this wish in our minds that would be nice to attain at some point. But until such point that it's real, we have to work really hard. We have to do something from a position of, I don't have it yet. It's not in my life, and therefore I can't experience the freedom of having it because I don't have it. And there's a couple of things about this which I've struggled with for a really long time, and I guess to some degree still explore. And the first thing is that the idea that something out there, something I can acquire, can give me freedom. And the challenge I have with this is that if I can get something, and that something can make me feel a particular way, then if that thing is taken away from me, or if that thing comes to its natural end, or is lost, then surely the sense of freedom is lost with it. And we can apply this to anything in the world that we can attain, including money, relationships, houses, cars, jobs, even our health at some point can be affected. Certainly as we get older, and even the way that our bodies look and the way that our bodies appear in the mirror will change as time goes on, and eventually the body itself will be subject to the passage of time and will come to its natural end. And I appreciate many of us don't think about this because it's not a particularly positive subject. But at the same time, being aware of the fact that the body will come to its natural end kind of puts everything else into perspective, really. And that's not to say that wanting anything is a bad thing. There's nothing wrong with aspiring to more, but are you aspiring to more, or am I aspiring to more because I want to feel more than I do now, or am I aspiring to more because that's just my nature? Because I'm driven, for reasons I may or may not understand, to something more expansive than I currently experience. The second thing is the feeling of freedom is something that we place on objects, and those objects can be taken away from us, then it's not really stable. And many of us, myself included, spend a great deal of time and energy looking for stability, looking for guarantees that something, someone, some set of circumstances will never change, and therefore we can depend upon those things. And to some degree we find those. Our cars might be reliable, our houses don't continuously fall down or change shape. The relationships that we find ourselves in are to some degree reasonably predictable, for better or for worse. But again, there's only a degree of stability in those things. It's not inherent, and it's certainly not consistent throughout the course of time that we get to engage with those things. So where do we look? And what does that mean? To answer the second question first, what it means is that we're placing our hope in something to give us what it can't. So no relationship or house or car or job or set of circumstances can truly give us stability. It cannot truly give us a foundation upon which we can build our lives. It can give us a sense of that for a period of time, but it's not everlasting. And there is a degree of disappointment, perhaps even sadness in that, knowing that the things we place so much faith and hope and trust in will at some time or point in our lives fail us. But if we can be aware of that, and we can accept that and consider that that's just the nature of things in the physical world, that they will at some point come to pass, then first of all it softens the blow, but secondly it gives us an opportunity to look somewhere else. And if we're looking somewhere else for stability that isn't out there, then it can only be in here. And we'll start with looking at the contents of the mind and saying, well, let's try and create some kind of stable thinking platform so we can always think positively or always think consistently. And for any of you that have ever tried to control your minds, that's really bloody hard. And there is a point whereby the mind can be fixed and focused on certain things. But the nature of the mind is change also. And so at some point you may wake up or you may find yourself thinking something unusual or unpleasant. And then the cycle kind of starts again, and I go through this cycle all the time, where I get to a point where I'm thinking, okay, life is reasonably stable and predictable or comfortable or enjoyable. And then the next moment or the next day I'll wake up and it looks the complete opposite. So I start to question the worth of all of the things I'm doing to arrive at that point. So what's beyond that? And what is it inside of us that can even articulate the awareness that this is happening? And I appreciate that might be an abstract question. It may be a question that you aren't necessarily accustomed to asking yourself, or I'm not accustomed to asking myself, which in many ways I'm not. But if we all look a bit deeper, whether that's through a practice of meditation, whether it's through some period of reflection, or whether it's just through the recognition of something deeper than the product of what we think, what we find is that there's this place inside of us where anything that comes through the mind is observed to some degree. Anything that happens in the world is observed to some degree. And for as far back as any of us can remember in our lives, there's always been a point of observation inside of us. Observation without preference or narrative or polarity. And that point of observation inside of us has observed the narrative changing as our lives have evolved, and has observed the polarity of experience, and has observed the preferences that we have for various things and their changes over time. And it's just kind of there. But because it's there, we don't tend to acknowledge it. We don't tend to recognize the existence of something which, relative to everything else in our lives, is actually stable, is actually constant, is actually unchanging. So what would happen if we spent more of our waking lives in recognition of that? What would happen if we spent more of our lives acknowledging that there is something inside of us that is aware of our desperate search for freedom out there, and is also aware of the, you could say, the futility of that, but itself doesn't exercise a preference. It doesn't exercise any kind of narrative. It just observes the narrative changing as time goes on. And from time to time, when the narrative stops, either because we have some kind of very powerful experience, or through the practice of meditation or some other practice, the mind just has a break, that's what we're left with. And to give ourselves a bit more time to look back into ourselves at that place within us which doesn't change, it does start to unfold and unravel into our lives. It does give us, in a sense, permission to stop looking out there for something to reassure us or validate us or make us feel understood. And those things will arise from time to time, and that's great, but we don't have so much of a need for them. And one could argue that freedom is the absence of need. And that doesn't mean we have no desire to do anything. It simply means that the things that we're doing because we can, rather than because we're trying to get something out of it. And that might be counter to much of what the traditional worldview would suggest, which is you are not enough and you won't be enough until you have all of this stuff. And by the way, we have it to sell you. But just because it's commonly accepted as fact doesn't mean it's actually true. And if it causes suffering, I would argue, what's its true value? If you're in pursuit of something that causes you hardship, what's its value? What's it amounting to? And when you achieve it, what have you spent? What's the true cost to arrive at that point? Versus looking in the opposite direction, the true cost of which is turning away from the voice of the world which shouts so loudly towards something inside of you which doesn't shout at all, it's simply there. And realizing that actually maybe in the silence there is something far more valuable, far more stable, far more dependable and trustworthy than any voice which appears externally. And maybe in awareness of that, the voices externally may change, or you may decide to move in a different direction or gravitate towards a different kind of voice. But without the awareness, without the opportunity to know at some level there is a choice, then by default you only have one way to move. And many of us are in that position. And when I find myself on those days that clarity is not so forthcoming, that's the direction I will look, by default, by habit. And it's not necessarily the case that we find that sense of freedom in an instant. It may be a practice, it may take time, but surely something that you have already and are able to continue uncovering, irrespective of the circumstances you may find yourself in. Surely that has value. Especially if it relieves you of some of the suffering or discomfort you experience in your life. It relieves you of the need for approval of others, or the need to achieve something which isn't natural or inherent to you. It's simply a function of a suggestion that someone else or society has made. And what's the value of that? So finding a bit of a break from these things, putting them into perspective, or at least having another perspective to work with, opens up a much broader range of choice. And I would argue that's quite helpful. And I want to be clear, I'm not trying to position myself in such a way where I have all of the answers. But for many years, I've been looking ever more intensely towards that unchanging place within me. And I find, as a result of doing this, many things. First of all, my life becomes considerably simpler, and I stop chasing the things which are not going to give me happiness, for the most part, despite what the world may suggest. Secondly, I have the opportunity to listen more deeply to myself, which includes listening to what some may call intuition or inspiration or creativity, a place within me where ideas arise which are far more inspired than the crap that goes around in my mind most of the time. And I'm just more okay with being me. How many of us can say that? So if those are things that you have an aspiration for or desire or would like to explore, then I'll do my best to expand on those subjects as time goes on. And if there's anything particular then that you would like me to explore or to expand upon, then please let me know in the comments. And thank you for watching.